I thought I'd give you a view of what sunny looks like. This is the Newport Beach Pier, and so it adorned the website for this conference, a little bit of truthiness in advertising, I suppose. I'd like to start out this event by first thanking the organizers for an exciting program. Kayla, Tom, Becca, Hank, and Kate. This is a very good team indeed, very crisply organized, and even at the last minute, moving from one ballroom to another. It's fantastic. I also would want to alert everybody to the INSNA leadership team. I'm John Skvorts. I'm the president. I suppose I should have introduced myself to begin with. Katie Faust is the vice president. Katie is down here. Laura Cayley is the treasurer. Laura is right there in the middle. And the rest of the individuals are members of INSNA's board. If you all would sort of stand, so people, if you're here, okay, if you're not, don't stand, so folks can see who you are and maybe come and talk to you. There you go. Thank you very much. It's my job to figure out how this remote works first, to give awards. I once went to a talk by Andrew Abbott, who said that the main purpose of scholarly associations is to give awards, okay? So in this case, we are executing our main purpose. I would like to especially thank the Student Paper Award Committee, Dan Helgen, Chris Markham, and Ali Marin. They really had quite a task. There were 21 submissions, all of them of excellent quality. It boiled down really to two, and since we really can't give two awards, we ended up giving an honorable mention and then the actual award itself. So the honorable mention goes to a paper by Andras Voros with Tom Schneiders called Cluster Analysis of Multiplex Networks, defining composite network measures. I must put my glasses on to read this. Is Andras there? I didn't see him in the program. No? Is Tom here? Okay, well, I'll just keep this certificate for myself. All right. As I said, it was a very close call indeed. The person who paper that actually won the award was by Marie Hewlett. Did I get that right? Did I say that right? And so if she would come up, the paper is entitled let's see here, Network Periphery, Group Boundaries, and the 40 Individuals in the Toronto 8 Terrorist Network. So congratulations. The award comes with a cash prize of $2,500, and that cash prize is subvented by and supported by the royalties from Carrington, Scott, and Wasserman's volume. The authors of that edited volume kindly signed off their royalties to INSNA to help support this award. And if you're interested in hearing this paper, which I'm sure you are if you're around on Saturday at 2 p.m., I think it is in the Networks and Religion session. All right, the main award tonight, though, is for the Freeman Award, all right? And special thanks to the Freeman Award Committee, David Lazar, Arno Vanderreit, and Beate Volker. They also had a very difficult job. There were 10 nominations, all of very qualified individuals. They sorted through it all. And as you know, the Freeman Award is given to a distinguished young scholar in the field of social networks for significant contributions to the scientific study of social structure. And the award, as chosen by the committee, goes to Zachary Neal of Michigan State University. Zachary, where are you? Zachary will actually have his Freeman Award address next year, as is customary, and it will be in Beijing, okay, China, which is where the next Sun Belt will be held. Very appropriately, because Zachary is probably best known for his work in city networks, okay? I don't know if you know a lot about Beijing and its network, but I was in Xi'an when we had an INSNA-sponsored conference there, and the drivers in China obey very different rules of the road than I was used to, and so I'm assuming that has something to do with with urban networks. So the Freeman Award winner, Zachary Neal, Michigan State University. If you come to China next year, you will hear his address. And speaking of which, okay, segueing, Sunbelt 37, yes, 37, will be in Beijing, China. It'll be the 30th of May, 2017, which is a Tuesday, and it will go through Sunday, the 4th of June, 2017. So I urge you all to mark your calendars, because the keynote speaker has already been selected, and that speaker is Ron Burt, okay? The organizers of the conference are listed there. Yanji Bian, who's a member of the board of INSNA, Jardel Liu, who is, I saw him, there he is, okay. He is the former president of the Chinese Social Network Association, or he was still president of the association? Okay, right. Rui Mei Sung, Pilin Li, Huang Li, and Dan Chunran are going to be the co-organizers, the organizing committee. All right, so what you should do is definitely mark your calendar, okay? The weather in Beijing is expected to be sunny, okay? And so we will all enjoy our visit to China. All right, that's it for the business portion of this event, and I will turn it over to, one more thing, finally. There is a business meeting for all INSNA members, and that is going to be held on Saturday at 12:20 in Salon 3. An agenda for that meeting will be available at the door, and so those of you who are around then and and are INSNA members and want to stop in, please do. I think typically we have a small box lunch there for members who attend the meeting, and we discuss general matters about future Sun Belts, and give my annual report to the membership. All right, I think now that's it. Let's see. Yes, okay. All right. Let's try not to destroy too many things.
So before I introduce you to our keynote speaker, Gary Robbins, a few important housekeeping. We will have a reception with a bar after this event. As soon as you exit these doors here in the lobby, and there'll be some refreshments. So we welcome everyone to join us for that. And the banquet following the reception will be back in here if you've purchased a ticket for that. If you're still waiting to pick up your ticket, it will be at the door when you come. So my job tonight is to introduce Gary Robbins, the Semel Award recipient for the Sun Belt Conference this year. For those of you who don't know and who haven't sifted through the INSNA website, the Semel Award is given annually to the Sun Belt keynote speaker, and they're selected by the conference organizing committee and also the board of directors of INSNA. And it's named in honor of George Simmel, a German sociologist who pioneered the study of social structure. So tonight we are awarding this to Gary Robbins, who is professor at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne in Australia. And I first met Gary 10 years ago when I was a student in his Introduction to Social Network Analysis course at the University of Melbourne. It was a week-long introductory course, and there was sort of a wild mix of students there. I remember a couple key people in particular. One girl, Kim, who was coming down from Northern Australia to look to study cow social networks and how they could breed cows that were more social. And another guy, Sam, who ended up becoming a good friend of mine, who was working in these big mining organizations in Australia and was interested in studying how interpersonal relationships impacted these mining companies. And I was there as an undergraduate looking to see if social networks could help me study social influence on eating behaviors and how cultures of unhealthy eating had proliferated so much. So this was the sort of wild group of people that Gary met during this week. And so his job teaching us was to introduce us to ideas of nodes and edges and social structure, and to concepts of structural balance and weak ties and network diffusion, and eventually to have a rich understanding of things like network autocorrelation and exponential random graph models. So I think we all learned a lot that week, but what we definitely all got out of it was a keen interest in learning more about social networks. And so now, 10 years later, Kim and Gary are publishing work on bovine social networks. Sam is still working and publishing in organizational network structure. And I'm continuing to do work applying network science to health behaviors and health interventions. So from my perspective, one of Gary's most valuable contributions to network science is that he is a great teacher, and that he is great at getting very complex network ideas translated to people who are applying them in a huge range of fields. And he's also an incredibly effective hub in the network community, working across all of these different applied fields of people working on various problems in the real world. So Gary has also not limited his role in teaching and linking people to network science just to academic and organizational communities. This is Gary in action, explaining the small world to Pete, who is an important personality in TV in Australia, if you know Pete. And so to understand why Gary is such a valuable hub in the social network analysis community and a critical bridging node for this community to such a diverse group of people who are applying these concepts, we need to look a little bit more at his background. So Gary has completed a Bachelor of Science honors degree in mathematics, as well as a Bachelor of Arts honors degree and PhD in mathematical psychology at the University of Melbourne. And most people in the room came across Gary around this period. But some of the answers to Gary's successful position as this bridging hub in network science lie in this 20 period here that we need to look at a little more closely. So long before Gary entered our world of network science, he was collaborating with communities all over the world. He served as Foreign Affairs Officer in the Australian government's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. His positions included posts in Papua New Guinea, Canberra, Singapore, London, Moscow, and Dublin. The last post where he was chargé d'affaires and ran the embassy. And you might be wondering, like I was, what does a first secretary do each day? I remember when I first started working with the Melnet group, and that Gary's sort of past pre-academic life was a bit of a mystery. And one of the first times I visited there, I remember postdoc Galina asking her something about Gary, and her saying that it wasn't until a few years into her postdoc that she even realized that Gary spoke Russian. And she was out in the hallway having a private conversation, and at some point realized Gary actually understood everything that was being said. So Gary suggested that the job includes anything from marrying people to attending autopsies, to drinking vodka in Russia. And he told me that it looked a little bit like this sometimes. But I think we can all assume that there was definitely a little bit of this. And I've definitely heard the widespread theory that Gary is just, in fact, posing as a successful academic and leading a secret foreign affairs mission, and that has yet to be disproven from my research. But needless to say, the work that he did before joining our community definitely fostered a real strength in him in how to communicate and collaborate with a really diverse group of different communities and people. So in the early 1990s, after Gary declined I'm sure, very lovely invitation to take a posting in Baghdad just before the first Gulf War, he opted for a somewhat less nomadic lifestyle based in academia in Melbourne. Along with his wife, Jane, who is joining us from Melbourne tonight and is here for the week, and their daughter, Olivia. And he completed his honors degree and then PhD with Pip Pattison as his primary advisor. And based on his PhD work, he was awarded the Psychometric Society Dissertation Prize, as well as a Distinguished Dissertation Award from Division 5, Evaluation, Measurement, and Statistics of the American Psychological Association. And since then, he's had academic appointments in the School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne, where he is currently professor, as well as the School of Psychology at Deakin University in Melbourne. So Gary's principal work in social networks has been methodological, which I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, focusing on the development of exponential random graph models and making very important contributions to the P-star class of models that was first proposed by Franken-Strauss, Pattison, Wasserman, and many others in this room. His key papers on ergoms are highly cited and influential. Two of these papers, published in 2007, won him the I2 Award for the most highly cited papers from INSNA in 2011 and 2012. And with collaborators Peng Wang, who's here, and Pip Pattison, and many others from the MELNet group, they have developed the PNet package, which I know many of you use and has a wide application for ergoms in various applications. And his most recent book, Doing Social Network Research, appeared in 2015 and is a really thoughtful guide on the application of social network analysis and social network theory that's very accessible to social scientists in really any discipline. Gary's had many collaborators in applied network science, for instance, epidemiology, animal and bovine behavior, defense, organizational studies, and environmental policies. And overall, he has over 160 published works listed in Google Scholar with over 7,000 citations. And he's also the past winner of the Freeman Award here from INSNA. So to end, this is a visualization of Gary's co-authorship network that reveals that Gary is truly a super hub among a vast field of not only prominent network methods, researchers, but also a huge group of people that are applying these approaches in a lot of important settings. Here, the red ties represent co-authorship primarily in the journal Social Networks. And other colored ties are co-authorships that are primarily established in other journals and diverse types of research communities. Gary's mentor, colleague, and collaborator, Pip Pattison, and one of the keynotes in Gary's co-authorship network, describes Gary in a way that I think resonates with many of us as an incredibly nice and clever person, generous, smart, fun, open to new ideas, committed to following through, and always doing everything really, really well. The absolute best collaborator that one could have. So with that, I would ask you to help me in welcoming Gary Robbins for the keynote address.
So, what am I talking about? Oh my God, it's not exponential random graph models. Thank you, Kayla, for that introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you very much for the Zimmel Award. It's a great honour. It's a wonderful opportunity to present this keynote. It's a very unexpected honour, I have to say. So I did think about exponential random graph models for this talk. But then I contemplated just a few years ago, Tom Schneiders gave an excellent keynote about the prospects and the future of statistical modelling and social networks. So, he's such a master in the field that I didn't intend to out-trump Tom in any sense. Actually, maybe trump is not the verb I'm looking for. So I thought I would pick on something else which is of current interest to me, and it's really a more theoretical thing. There will be a little bit of statistical stuff in here, but quite tame. It's much more theoretical, and it's about how we conceptualize networked social systems. And why I come to this question about conceptualization is because I'm not sure that we always automatically we automatically apply certain things without thinking them through, I think, sometimes. And I'm as guilty of that as anyone else. And I've come to realize that we need to think things through because I'm often asked the question, as I'm sure maybe all of you here are asked by people from outside, when you're doing network research with collaborators who are not familiar with it, they might ask the question of you, how can I make my network more effective? So, these might be organizational scholars, they might be scholars interested in environmental systems and how to manage environmental systems. And so, I'm asked this and I'm actually not sure that I know the answer. Now, I know some of you in this room have studied such things, especially in organizational contexts, where you talk about work structure for work, team effectiveness, and so on. But generally, the question of network effectiveness is a kind of really tricky one for us, I think. We have plenty to say about outcomes for individuals within networks, don't we? So we can talk about structural holes, we can talk about people in the core of a network or on the periphery, we can talk about high centrality people, actors, we can talk about social support and so on. So lots of stuff we can say about individuals within networks and the outcomes for them. But the outcomes for the system as a whole is kind of a rather tricky question, I think. So even when we have some idea about what counts as an outcome for the system as a whole, so for instance, when I do some environmental governance research, we kind of have a sense that, we want our environmental system to be resilient, right? Okay, so then how do I tackle the question of resilience if I measure resilience? We want resilience for the long term, and if you're like me, your funding stops about here. So you're not entirely sure, resilience, how can I get a handle on this? So even when there's an idea of what counts as effectiveness, it's really hard to sometimes get a serious sense of how we're going to study that empirically, because we're not sure that we've seen an effective network. But I was thinking about this. We do know, sometimes we do have instances where a social system, a network, if you like, fails. You can see the failure. So maybe I was thinking we should think about what are the structural preconditions that we need in place to describe failure first, and that might give us a hint about understanding success. So in this talk, I'm going to take one particular instance of the failure of a network social system, and I'm going to see what our vocabulary as network researchers can provide to that system. How can we explain that and describe it in a way that does justice to the thick data, not just the big data, but the thick data of description that emerges in this, that is available in this particular system. So I'm going to pick something that was clearly a failure, and it's the outbreak of World War I. And there are some reasons why I think this is of interest. First of all, it's clearly a failure. It's a failure of a social system. It's an endogenous failure. This is important because you can have a failure of a system, say, due to some huge natural catastrophe. You know, people in this room have studied networks and Hurricane Katrina, for instance. But this is a failure of a system that kind of collapsed under its own weight. So it's an endogenous collapse. World War I. And of course, it's 100 years ago, more or less, a little over 100 years ago now. And so all of these books started to appear around about the 100th anniversary. Excellent historical books, excellent books by historians. But I think they give shed some new light on the outbreak of World War I. Now, before I go any further, let me say I'm not here posing as an expert on World War I. So, you know, if there's anyone here who is expert in this area and wants to contradict anything I say about facts and so on, I'm happy to be advised. This is not my point. My point is I take a particular description from these books and think about how would we as network researchers conceptualize the social system and do an adequate job of meeting the description? What's the minimum kind of network representation that we need for this purpose? So this is just history, isn't it? Well, no. Think about it. World War I occurred, the outbreak of World War I followed the terrorist assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in mid-1914. And each of these writers, and I think Clark most tellingly, emphasised the modernity of this, so that this is actually closer to us here today than it was 20 or 30 years ago, the height of the Cold War, where this seemed like just sort of past stuff. But now we don't have a problem, do we? We fully understand how a terrorist incident may lead to war between nations, which is something that seemed very remote in the 1980s. The Clark book in particular has been, as I understand it, read by Angela Merkel and assigned as homework by her to the rest of her cabinet. So obviously the German government thinks that this has a sort of, as Clark says, a raw modernity. And clearly it was a collapse. I think to me, my limited knowledge, there is new thinking about World War I emerging in these books, and it's quite interesting for us as network researchers. First of all, the use of the term network is much more explicit. So I suspect this was not the case in a lot of the past literature. So Clark, this is not a network analysis, but Clark certainly talks about networks in the way that we would as network researchers. If it's not network thinking, it's systems thinking. So Levin is a very interesting writer and talks about structural problems, deep structural problems in international politics. Hey, structural problems, that sounds like the topic that we should be able to say something about as social network researchers, as the researchers of network-based social systems. There is definitely very explicit multi-level thinking, which maybe was always there, but now it is really explicit most particularly, again, by Levin, who talks about three particular levels. One is the kind of level of the nation state, where the broad geopolitical, strategic level of analysis. The second is the level of the individual decision makers. You know, in 2 weeks, in a diplomatic crisis following 2 weeks, 50 men made decisions that led to world war. And then there's another very interesting level, which I think is a bit of a challenge for us as network researchers, although some people in this room have thought about it in great depth. And that's about another level about assumptions and values and mentalities. That's how Levin describes them. I will come back to each of those. And then each of the three authors make it clear, from their point of view, the war did not have to happen. There is no fate here. There is no remorseless grinding of the Marxist wheels of history. It could have been different. It did not have to happen. And Clark says the people, events, and forces carried in them the seeds of other, perhaps less terrible futures. Now, I don't know about you, but when I reflected on this at some length, as a child of the 20th century, I was shocked, because it made me realize that some of the brutality maybe didn't have to happen. And maybe we didn't really have to put up with the butchers like Hitler and Stalin and others. I found that personally troubling. Maybe it's just obvious. Now, when we look at social network studies of war, there aren't that many that I could find, at least. Maybe there are others. This is an example published in 2013 about across 2 centuries of warfare. And we've got the various countries who fought wars against each other. And they do, it's a nice paper, they do the things that you might expect to do in a social network analysis. They calculated centrality scores and so on. I just don't think, I mean, this is a good paper, but I don't think this is going to give us any insights into the outbreak of World War I. Let me be clear, I don't believe that some of our standard stock in trade will answer that sort of question. The outbreak of World War I has nothing to do with centrality or degree distributions. Preferential attachment will not occur in my account. Small worlds will not feature. So if that's the case, we have to think about what is our standard stock in trade and what is it doing? Let me start about the famous alliance structure among the nation states. These are the 5 major powers, European powers at the time, that were directly involved in the outbreak of World War I. Of course, there were other major powers and other minor powers and so on. But let me, for the moment, concentrate on these 5. And I'm very well aware that, and I'll talk very briefly about it in a minute, overlaying this alliance structure were various plans for military mobilization that led to a kind of layer of geospatial temporality in this. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm really not going to dwell on that very much, although I will mention it briefly. So there are kind of additions and elaborations of what I'm going to propose that can be added. So yes, there were other powers, and it's also impossible to tell the story without some understanding of the role of the Balkan states. So I've just picked Serbia here. The Russians had an alliance with the Serbians, and the Austrians were very angry with the Serbians, perhaps I should put it that way, after the assassination of the Archduke. Because it is a historical fact that Serbian military intelligence sponsored this assassination attempt. It was state-sponsored terrorism in our terms today. So some of that elements will come into the story in a minute, but let me just go back to the 5. So what counts as collapse? I'm talking about collapse of the system. Well, you know that collapse when they all declare, 2 alliance blocks declare war on each other. That's well and good. There's another possibility, another possible representation. So there are choices here for us as analysts and researchers. There are choices we make where the Austrians did not at the beginning fight the French and the British. So we can make those choices. Notice well, actually, let me just pause here for a moment. So already in this representation, we've got positive and negative ties, obviously. That's, I guess, inevitable with a representation of war. So there are people in this audience who are talking about positive and negative ties in this conference. And so, negative ties, I think, are really probably quite important to understand in many contexts and absolutely crucial in this context. I've left in this particular visualization the edges undirected, but there's some value in thinking about the war edge, the attack, as directed. So, the Russians attack the Austrians and there's a response. This is a kind of subtlety because it gives some sense of the process of events, but more importantly, if the Austrians attack the Serbians, the Russians attack the Austrians. So this is really quite important to make this directed because it gives that sense of intentionality there. But there are choices here that one can make, and it depends on the way you wish to conceptualize the representation. Okay. So I'm going to talk now, having set that up, about network dependence. And in a sense, that's our business dependence. Any social network represents some form of dependence among the nodes, or at least that's what I would say. So here it's certainly the case that the Austrians depended on the Germans for military support, and so on. But there's more than that. There is dependence amongst the alliance ties, or to be very precise, in social network research, I think we have dependence between tie variables. And this is a little bit of statistics speak, but I'll slip out of the statistics speak in a minute. And why do we think that's the case? Well, because all of us here believe in network structure. There's not one person here who I think believes the world is adequately described by simple random graphs, Erdős-Rényi graphs. I'd be surprised if anyone here is committed to that. Therefore, the network is structured in certain ways. So if the network's structured in certain regularized patterns, structural regularities, the only way you can get that is if the ties depend on each other in some way. So preferential attachment is about tie dependence. A new tie is created based on existing ties. And there are theories of network dependence which actually relate quite explicitly to exponential random graph models, but also implicitly to certain forms of stochastic actor-oriented models. And I submit that any form of statistical model, indeed any form of social network analysis that moves beyond simple random graph, carries with it an implicit theory of dependence amongst ties. This is kind of like deep network theory. Most of the time we don't recognize it or think about it, and we just get on with whatever we're doing, but I think that it's an important thing to have at least in the back of our mind. And in some senses, in some cases, I think it is really valuable to know what's the theory of network dependence you're thinking with, or you're working with. So I'm going to talk about a few of these theories of network dependence, and I'll start with Markov dependence, which was introduced by that great founder of network statistical methods, Uwe Frank, with David Strauss in the 1980s. And they proposed a very simple extension of independence, whereby two tie variables, two ties if you like, to speak loosely, depend on each other if they emanated from the same node. Very simple idea. So the alliance between France and the UK in some sense depends on the alliance between France and Russia, or you could have the opposite. The alliance between France and Russia in some sense depends on the absence of an alliance between France and Germany. Now, what Frank and Strauss showed way back in the 1980s was that if you accepted this theory of dependence, simple as it is, then it necessarily followed, there is no choice here, it necessarily followed that you are really believing that your network is built up of star-like structures and of triangles. Star-like structures, degrees, centrality if you like. Triangles, network closure. So two of the really basic ideas that we carry through our social network research and analysis arise from this kind of deep meta-theory, if you like, of Markov dependence. So star-like structures like that, or triangles like that. The very famous Schlieffen Plan, which was about the mobilization of the German army to fight a war on two fronts simultaneously, can be seen as an example of directed Markov dependence. Markov dependence involving directed ties. So this is Count von Schlieffen here. And the point here is that the Germans figured the Russians correctly would take longer to mobilize. So the idea was that some sort of form of blitzkrieg attack on the French, defeat the French and turn back to defeat the Russians. So in this case, mobilization, or if you like, an attack from the Russians on the Germans, lead to an attack by the Germans on the French. This is Markov dependence. It's very interesting to reflect on the Schlieffen Plan. For all of its military sophistication, it was probably a strategic disaster, and the world would maybe be a very different place if the Germans had adopted a different plan. But you know, interestingly enough, Markov dependence is not enough. The world cannot just be described by degrees and network closure. This is a good example. When it comes to the Austrians attacking the Serbians and the Russians attacking the Austrians, that's indeed the case. That's fine, that looks like Markov dependence, but it only makes sense if there's an alliance. It's an inexplicable process without an alliance structure. So this is really interesting. What we've got here is the situation where dependence emerges from existing structure. Existing ties, the presence of existing ties creates new dependence. The presence of the alliance creates this kind of Markov dependence, except it's not Markov dependence now. It's actually what my mentor and colleague Pip Patterson and I wrote about in 2002 as partial conditional dependence, which is an elaboration of Markov dependence, an extension of it, a new theory of dependence, where the presence of existing structure leads to, if you like, new dependence and hence the creation of new structure. This is about emergence. So with the presence of the alliance, you can explain the two paths. Otherwise, it's a bit mysterious. Now, when we were writing in 2002 about this, we talked about 4 cycles and how dependence can occur in 4 cycles. So, and again, the example is very clear here, I think. Because of the alliance structures, an attack by the Russians on the Austrians leads to an attack by the Germans on the French. So we have a structure here in 4-cycle terms. Now, I know when we were writing in 2002, we were only writing about individual networks with one type of tie, and here I've got a multiplex network of positive and negative ties, but nevertheless, the 4-cycle idea makes very good theoretical sense. And we know Markov dependence is not enough, because most exponential random graph models with only Markov parameters will not successfully converge into a sensible model. We need dependent structures that express emergence. This is not just a technical issue. This is a theoretical claim that human social networks create dependent structures that create new structures, and that we see the emergence through that process of network structure overall. And what that means is the existence of ties leads to new dependencies that can create new structure and also facilitate or constrain certain actions. So, let's think about the level of action. That was about nation states. However, there were these key decision makers who had to say, yes, we'll go to war, or no, we won't. And even though the majority of them wanted to say no, in the end, they all said yes. They were kind of overwhelmed by the structure, I'm going to say in a minute. So this is what we usually study, isn't it? This is so common. The level of individual actors. We're familiar with this kind of idea. And there was, in this case, the complete failure of collective action to avert war. So let me introduce you to a few of these individuals. So this is just representative. I mean, you might easily select others and select different network ties, but let me show you just what I've done here. This is George V of Britain. These are all the heads of state. Here's Kaiser Wilhelm and here's Tsar Nicholas. And I've put network ties here notionally between them because they were all cousins. They called themselves George and Nicky and Willie. They visited each other quite frequently. Here's President Poincaré of France, who at a crucial moment, as we'll see, was very close to the Tsar, so I've done a tie here. And here's the kind of Germanic axis between the two German emperors, the German Kaiser and the Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph. Okay, so you might want to have a different representation with different individuals and different ties. This is just purely schematic. But of course, these all relate to the countries, don't they? The countries haven't gone away simply because I've got some pictures of men with moustaches. So the men with moustaches relate to particular individual countries. And of course, there's more than this. There's a kind of governmental structure around each of these individuals. And of course, some of these individuals, the five heads of state were really important. Others, like George V, just a constitutional monarch, really didn't have much to say in the decision making. But nevertheless, we mustn't forget the governmental structure, and that's an important, potentially important part of the story. I'm going to ignore the within government structure in what I'm going to say from this point on. So what we have here is a multi-level network structure, where we have two levels of different types of nodes with connections between them. Now let me be clear. I call this a multi-level structure. I know the term multi-layer has become popular in some literatures, and I think a multi-layer network, which is often used for multiplex, what I call multiplex networks. Multi-layer networks, I think, relate to a particular type of data structure. This is not a data structure. This is a theoretical conceptualization, and there is no doubt that these are at different levels. So just as in much of multi-level social science, we are talking about different levels, we should use the appropriate terminology. So to my way, this is a multi-level network. It's the theorization that drives it. Of course, if you have data now, my colleague Peng Wang has devised exponential random graph models to fit multi-level networks. And there's a lot of stuff going on about multi-level networks, so I encourage you to look at the very recent edition of Social Networks, which has a special issue on multi-level social networks, lots of interesting articles in there. And then this book by Emmanuel Lazaga and Tom Schneiders, edited by them, published by Springer, also has lots of multi-level stuff in there. Of course, Emmanuel has been an important driver of multi-level network theory with his Big Fish in Small Ponds work. So I encourage you to look at these resources. One thing that I've been really interested in multi-level networks, this is a bit of a digression, is in social ecological systems, where it's clear that there are two levels. Forget this multi-layer stuff. So the two levels are social units with social connections between them, and ecological units with ecological dependencies between them, and the social units manage, in some sense, the ecological units. This Burden and Tengo paper is the first proper network representation of a social ecological system. And so I encourage you to look at that. We should be applauding this type of conceptualization. Now, when we've been doing some work in this, it's kind of interesting because the cross-level configurations, cross-level effects, dependencies, structures, can be related to existing literature about social ecological systems. So the cross-level triangle is about collaboration in managing a common pool resource. A cross-level four cycle, notice I've got Markov triangles and social circuit four cycles in here. Cross-level four cycle is sometimes, it's described here as ecological feedbacks, but actually more simply it's about scale of fit. So the scale of the ecological dependencies is matched by the scale of human cooperation. So these are kind of interesting ideas, and so we theorize, and it's only theoretical at the moment, we theorize that these closed cross-level structures are good for resilience in environmental systems. Now, that's open to empirical investigation, but that's where we are in theoretical terms. When we come to World War I, there are plenty of these cross-level closed structures. Here's a triangle where the Tsar and his foreign minister Sazonov, and they were Sazonov clearly had important influences on the Tsar in the crucial days in 1914. Here is a cross-level four cycle. Poincaré visited St. Petersburg just a couple of weeks before the advent of war. And they discussed alliance issues, and Poincaré essentially G'd up the Tsar to oppose so-called aggression by Germany and Austria-Hungary. This is a non-closed cross-level structure. Very interesting. Why do I put this up? Well, because in the days and the hours almost before war finally happened, the Kaiser and the Tsar exchanged maybe up to a dozen telegrams attempting to stop it. Now, these two are autocrats. The Tsar is the commander-in-chief of the Russian army and can just say, no, we're not going to war, and there will be no war. So Willie was sending telegrams to Nicky saying, let's stop this. But they didn't. Why didn't they? Well, in the end, the closed structures, this is our terms, the historians have a different way of saying it, but if I want to translate what they're saying into our network terms, the closed structures overwhelmed this kind of non-closed cross-level three-path. And the Tsar decided the Russians would continue to mobilize. So in this sense, I think we can think about how cross-level dependence can solidify certain structures and circumscribe certain individual actions. Okay, so look, here's an interesting question for you. If the cross-level dependencies are where a lot of the action's going on, we need to think about cross-level network effects. We need to think about them theoretically, which we're not doing enough of, maybe because it's early days in multi-level network research, but this is not an empirical question. It's a theoretical question which can be informed by empirical results. So here's a good theoretical question. I've spoken about cross-level closure in the environmental situation as being perhaps good for resilience. But maybe in the case of World War I, it was bad for stopping the war. So what are the conditions? Are there conditions under which we can say that cross-level closure is in some sense good or bad for some particular outcome? What does it really mean? What can we say about it? And so, there's one further thing I want to talk about. And it relates to Lieben's third level about values and ideas. And these may be private ideas held by individuals, but also public action. So there's a kind of politico-cultural context here. And I think the story cannot be told. We cannot do justice to the thick data unless we incorporate this third level of analysis. So this is where I'm up to, right? Let me just introduce a couple of new characters going back 6 years in time to the foreign ministers of Russia and Austria, Izvolsky and Ehrenthal, in 1908. And they met in 1908, famously. And what they attempted to do was to do a deal. They wanted to do a deal over the Balkans. The Balkans were very problematic because of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in Europe at the time. And what happened here was that the deal failed. The outcome of this was that for the next 6 years, the Russians and the Austrians never trusted one another. So why did the deal fail? Well, it became public, and Izvolsky in particular was attacked viciously in the Russian press for betraying our little Slavic brothers. That was the terminology that was used. And this kind of pan-Slavic ideology was used against Izvolsky. Eventually he had to resign as foreign minister. And so here we have a situation where a particular idea crucially affects the outcomes. In this case, it was a public idea. Now, the press in those days was, the social media of the time. So now we look at ideas very often through the prism of social media, don't we? Twitter and so on. So we should be familiar with the notion that we are looking at this cultural contestation, because that's what we're often interested about in, say, Twitter networks. In a sense, you can think of Izvolsky and Ehrenthal sort of sitting in the stew of ideas or memes, or constructs if you prefer the terminology, and these having some interesting effects on that level of decision. Now, today when we study social media, there's lots of wonderful studies being conducted. So, and what are the questions that we often ask? We ask about who are the prominent information spreaders, what are the prominent messages, for instance, you know, if the messages are being diffused, what's the influence process? And because Twitter is a stream of data, you know, there are interesting temporal questions to be asked about how things come into and out of focus and so on. That's all great, but they're all within level, those questions, within the level of the social media network. So it's interesting to reflect on, I don't know of too much work in this direction, there's a little bit, but of how best to think about how this level impacts on the level of decision makers, crucial decision makers. So in one sense, what we've got is this multi-level network structure, and we've got a whole bunch of what I'm going to call memes down here. And the memes, as I said, can be public, like Pan-Slavic ideology, or they may be private, but nevertheless widely adopted, like how long do we expect a war to last? How bad do we think it's going to be? What does it mean to be a nation state? What does it mean to have honour as a statesman? All of these are interesting ideas that the three historians discuss. So we could extract, I think, I'm not entirely sure how best to do this, but I know there are people in this audience who are studying networks and words. We could extract from this information certain important and relevant memes, and they are very likely to have structure among them. How we discover that structure, how we represent that structure, is an interesting question for further research. But then that structure may feed back into this level of decision making. Now, I haven't said anything, I don't believe, that the historians would find problematic or disagree with. What I've done is to try and translate certain important points in their account into this kind of network world. And I think with this three-level structure, which includes the nation state, the individual decision makers, and some cultural level, if you like, you can call it something else if you prefer, I think we do sufficient justice to begin to translate it in our terms. And what I would say, and this is more or less what the historians say, is that the cross-level dependencies, cross-level structures, overwhelmed the individual decision makers, so that it was impossible for them, in the end, to avoid war. Which is, I guess, exactly what Angela Merkel wants to do by reading Clark's book. So let me not suppose that don't suppose rather I'm being prescriptive here. This is not going to be the right representation for all network-based social systems. But it does mean, you know, if you follow me so far, it does mean we might need to think about multi-level questions. We might need to think about how we incorporate cultural aspects into our social networks better than we do. You know, that was picked up by Emma Beyer and Goodwin and others in the 1990s, but in fact has, with some exceptions, and I know some people in this audience, like Ron, for instance, has been working on this, but it's not been, there hasn't been systematic research into how we best do that. But what's interesting when you think about it is that if this is a kind of sufficient description, at least for this system, and your system will be different, but if this is sufficient, then we have the tools to study all of these things. There's no problems about studying each bit, each element, but we've tended not to put these things together. And in particular, we've tended not to theorize about them. So I guess if I have a take-home message for from this talk. It's that we need to not just adopt a network conceptualization off the shelf and a method off the shelf. We need to think about the theoretical imperatives and the network description that will do justice to the needs of the social system. And then maybe, if we do that, we can start to get a handle on what counts in different contexts as network effectiveness. You know, what makes a network work. So I want to thank many people. Thank you for putting up with me. I particularly want to, and look, I've got many collaborators and co-authors and friends in this community, this very welcoming community, and I want to thank each and every one of you. You know who you are. I'm not going to go through a long list. But I particularly want to thank the people from Melbourne, obviously my mentor Pip Patterson, and my good colleagues from Swinburne University, including, importantly, Dean Lusher and Pang Wang, who we've worked together for a long time, and the current members of my research lab, Colin Gallagher, Alex Stavala, and David Rolls, and all past members of that lab, and all our friends who occasionally take the very long trip across the Pacific or the Indian Ocean to come and see us. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Gary. That was fantastic. And we do have a few minutes for a couple of questions if people would like some more clarifications about things or pose some questions that would be of general interest to the audience. Yes, Pat.
Brilliant talk, brilliant reconceptualization. What you've done is to look at past events to come up with a narrative to frame. Do you see any prospect for what you're proposing to become predictive?
So the question is, this is about a redescription of a past event. I'll repeat the question in case some people didn't hear it, which it obviously is, and is there predictive possibilities into the future? Well, I certainly hope so. So the work that we're doing on social ecological systems is a theoretical, multi-level network conceptualization. The plan is to get the theory right and to extend the data sets that we've got. Now, this is a collective enterprise. It can't be done by one person. It's very hard to get good data on these sorts of systems. But if you can do that across many research programs and across a number of years, then we will be able to say, hopefully, that this kind of structure is not only theoretically looks good, but it is empirically good as well, and it's predictive in that sense. So that's the plan there, and I hope that, but it's more than one person can do. This is about a research program for a community. So the first thing that needs to be done is to sell the conceptualization. See, we've done a great job of selling networks to the world. Now we have to sell these richer conceptualizations so that the data gets collected.
Someone else? Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
My question is, like at the end, when you started talking about the structure of cultural materials,
Ah, yes.
means in a relationship, I wonder if there's really that kind of structure works homologously with the other structures.
Ah, yes. Yeah. Okay. So the question is like, I did this hand-wavy network diagram of memes with little blue lines between them. Huh? So is that really what it's about at that cultural level? Well, the answer is I don't know, but I know some people are and have attempted to do that. But one thing I think is important to recognise is that structure on ideas are important. And the reason I suggest that, apart from anything else, is that my colleague Alex Stavala has done some simulation studies on basically on using the extensions of the Axelrod model, and you get different results if you assume different structures on the items to be diffused. And what's interesting about that is you have a kind of prototype structure, and there are good theories about prototypes in social psychology, then you will get something that broadly resembles empirical data. So if we do it, the classic Axelrod model assumes that there's no structure on the elements to be diffused. And this is different, so the structure counts. But we haven't thought enough about, I think, what counts as good structure at that level. So in that sense, I agree with the question.
Yes, one more. Okay, that wasn't a question, so that doesn't count.
Oh dear.
One more, yes.
Thank you. I'm sorry, you're going to have to repeat that a little louder because I didn't get it. Yep. Yeah. Oh, actually, yes. So the question is about where we might see feedback loops in this kind of representation. The feedback loops are implicit in the partial conditional dependence structures, actually. It's a bit too technical to describe, but actually these can ramify very, very quickly, because if you think about it, structure is building more structure. So you can get those sorts of feedback loops in that sort of domain, or that sort of area, I guess. So, you know, it is possible to have this. That may not be the complete answer for all social systems, but it's kind of implicitly there.
All right, please join me in thanking Gary once again. That was terrific.
Thank you.
We have a reception out in the lobby and then the banquet directly after, so please enjoy yourselves.